And new Americans, I count myself among them. I'm one of the immigrant hordes. Most of us are pro-immigration because we've lived it and we love this country. But most of us went through a pretty fucking difficult process to pay our way here and to go through the legal process. And it's an incredibly arduous and difficult and expensive procedure people go through to become Americans. And it took me a long, long time, but I got there in the end. But many of them will say, when the Democratic primary is all about who can come in without committing any crime at all, when you're going to legalize previously illegal border crossings, I know there's a distinction between civil and criminal offenses here, but the basic gist was everybody in. We don't really care if you're legal or illegal. That's what you heard. That's what I heard. Also, and so there may be lots of Latino votes in favor of effective immigration enforcement. It's certainly a proportion of them.
Well, I mean, I think one thing you see in South Texas in particular is that a lot of Hispanic origin people are working for the Border Patrol, or they have jobs constructing the border wall, right? And just to say, it's a community like any other where there are divisions based on people's occupation, based on people's position in the class structure. But it's just to say that the progressive conceit that everyone's politics should be shaped around the struggle against white supremacy or whatever is not. It just doesn't correspond to people's actual politics. No. I saw this very amusing scene in Virginia a couple weeks before the election, and it was Trump volunteers were getting together to do something, door knocking, and it was a mixed group of sort of white, classic MAGA people and Vietnamese immigrants, which is a conservative-leaning group. And they were having this incredibly bitter fight about masks because, the Vietnamese people, they're Asian origin people, and they have ties to their home country and that culture, and they're very different and, frankly, much more effective COVID-19 response. And the white Trump supporters are acting like stereotypes out of a liberal caricature of Trump people. But the first and second generation Vietnamese in Northern Virginia, they like the Republican Party. They don't want to come within 100 feet of anyone who will say anything good about socialism. And, I understand like the reference point of socialism for Bernie Sanders is something completely different from the Communist Party of Vietnam. And I totally appreciate that. But for Cuban and Venezuelan and Vietnamese and other people, it has a completely different meaning. And we're not all campaigning in Vermont. And the diverse
the people who self-select to come to America are the least likely to be adherents to the ideologies of the regimes from which they fled.
And
I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders is a communist, but there are associations in your mind. I came from at that point a socialist country, and that's partly why I loved America, because it wasn't as drearily socialist as my own homeland.
There's a symbolic politics for everybody, and it differs. And the diversity of the country cuts in both directions. Not everybody looks back as fondly on the good old days as some conservative people do, but also they have different outlooks. And, I think immigrants, I wrote a book earlier this year. It's called 1 Billion Americans. It's a fairly...
By all means, plug it. Tell us about it.
No, I think it's relevant. It's a fairly progressive book, I think, in terms of its policy prescriptions, but it's a patriotic book. It's about America and national greatness. And I got pushback from a lot of left-wing people, progressive people about that, right? Like, is it appropriate to be enthusiastic about America? I think it's appropriate. And also, obviously, people who come to America from other countries.
We didn't come here because we thought this place was a sinkhole of white supremacy.
And I always thought that Kamala Harris could do so much good for herself to talk about that, to talk about the fact that her parents came to the United States at a time when the racial situation was much worse than it is today. There was incredible levels of discrimination in place, and they were aware of that when they came here. But nonetheless, even at that time, they saw the United States as a place where they would have significant opportunities that
And
didn't
their
exist
daughter
for
is
them
now vice
in
president
India
of
and
the United
Jamaica.
States.
And yes, and it worked out, right?